Welcome back to Econverse, everybody. Today, we're tackling a question that I think a lot of us have probably pondered at some point, especially when we hear about economic troubles. Things like, why can't we just print more money to fix things?
Mhm.
It might seem like a straightforward solution on the surface, right?
Right.
But as we'll see, it's way more complicated. And this actually came from a question from one of our listeners, a 10-year-old named Caleb.
Oh, wow.
So, Caleb, thanks for this really insightful question. I'm Andy, and with me, as always, is Naomi. We've got a fascinating deep dive lined up for you all today, delving into the intricacies of money creation and its effects.
Yeah.
We'll be exploring things like how the amount of money in an economy can impact prices, those historical instances where printing too much money has led to some pretty disastrous outcomes, and even looking at some more recent research that offers some fresh perspectives on this whole debate.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really interesting topic.
So, Naomi, let's start with something that's really at the core of this. The connection between the money supply, which is basically the total amount of money circulating in an economy, and inflation.
Okay. Yeah.
Our sources are pretty clear that a country's money supply is a major player in whether or not inflation occurs.
Right.
And just to remind everyone, inflation is that ongoing increase in the prices we pay for goods and services. It often happens when the money supply grows faster than the economy's actual output, meaning the amount of stuff being produced.
Exactly. It's like imagine there's a small village and all they produce is 100 bananas.
Okay.
And there's, let's say, $100 circulating in this village. So on average, a banana would cost $1.
Right. Simple enough.
Now, let's say the village elders decide to print another $10. So there's $110. But they only managed to grow a few extra bananas, bringing the total to 105.
Hmm.
Now you've got more money chasing essentially the same amount of bananas.
Yeah. And so people might be willing to pay a bit more.
Exactly. People have a bit more cash and are eager to get their hands on those bananas, so they might offer $1 or 5, maybe even $1 for a banana. That's how increased demand, without a matching increase in supply, pushes prices up. More money, same amount of goods, higher prices. That's inflation in a nutshell.
Right. So it's that classic case of too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly.
And central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., have this crucial job of managing the money supply. They can adjust interest rates or buy and sell government bonds to influence how much money is out there.
Yeah.
And the main message here is, if the money supply grows faster than the economy's ability to actually produce stuff, you're setting the stage for inflation.
Right. It's like pushing the gas pedal without having enough fuel in the tank.
Exactly.
You might get a temporary burst of speed, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah. So this idea of the link between money supply and inflation, it's actually captured in a pretty famous economic theory called the quantity theory of money, or QTM.
Yeah, the QTM, a classic.
This theory has been around for centuries. It suggests that the value of money, just like any other commodity, is driven by its supply and demand.
Right. And the core concept is, if you increase the supply of something while demand stays relatively constant, its value tends to drop.
Okay, so how does this quantity theory of money actually play out in practice?
Well, they have a neat equation for it. MV equals PT. M represents the money supply. V is the velocity of money. This means how quickly money changes hands in the economy. So if people are spending rapidly, V is high. P is the average price level, and T is the total volume of transactions.
Okay.
Now, the key idea is if V and T remain relatively stable, then any increase in M, that is the money supply, will directly increase P, the price level. This means more money circulating leads to higher prices. That's the essence of the QTM's explanation for inflation.
Makes sense in a simplified model.
Yeah.
But of course, it's never that simple in the real world, is it?
No, not quite.
Our sources also point out that other factors can also influence inflation.
Absolutely. You see, while QTM gives us a basic framework, economists, especially those who follow Keynesian theories, have pointed to other important things that can also affect inflation.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, there's something called demand pull inflation.
Okay.
It's when consumer demand, maybe fueled by a larger money supply, outstrips the economist's capacity to produce.
So it's like too many people wanting to buy things at the same time.
Exactly.
And that pushes prices up.
Exactly. Then there's cost push inflation.
Oh, okay.
This is when the cost of producing goods and services goes up, maybe because of things like rising raw material costs or an increase in wages.
Yeah.
And these higher costs are then passed on to consumers as higher prices.
Makes sense.
So it's not just about the total amount of money, but also how fast people are spending it and how much it costs to make the things they're buying.
Right. Seems like a pretty complex interplay of factors.
It is.
Mm.
And there are situations where increasing the money supply doesn't instantly trigger this runaway inflation.
Okay. How so?
Well, for instance, if the economy is growing at a similar pace as the money supply, prices might remain stable.
Because there's more stuff being produced to meet the increased demand.
Precisely. And then there's the velocity of money, remember. If during a recession, even if there's more money available, people might choose to save more and spend less.
Hmm.
So that would reduce the immediate pressure on prices.
I see.
And lastly, if an economy has spare capacity, like factories not working at full speed, increasing the money supply could actually encourage more production instead of just pushing up prices.
Interesting.
So while more money can lead to inflation, it's not the only factor, and the effect isn't always instant or directly proportional.
Right. So it's not just about the quantity of money, but also about how it's being used and the overall state of the economy.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic system.
But what happens when things go really wrong? Yeah. When the growth in the money supply far exceeds the growth in goods and services.
Oh, that's when we venture into the very scary realm of hyperinflation. It's when a country's currency loses value so rapidly that people lose all faith in it.
And we have some pretty sobering examples from history, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Take
Yeah.
Germany in 1923, for example.
Yeah, the classic example.
After World War I, the government tried to deal with its massive war debts by printing a ton of money.
Hmm.
The consequences were catastrophic. Prices skyrocketed. You literally needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy everyday items like bread or a newspaper. Imagine that. It wiped out people's savings, their entire livelihoods.
It's hard to even fathom the kind of disruption and hardship that must have caused.
It was truly devastating. And it's not a unique case. We also see Zimbabwe in 2008 in our sources.
Okay.
Their inflation rate spiraled out of control, reaching unimaginable levels, making basic necessities completely unaffordable.
And these are just a couple of examples.
Right. And then there's Hungary in 1946, where prices were doubling every few hours. Imagine that. Trying to run a business or even just buy groceries when the value of your money is plummeting that fast. These historical episodes are stark warnings about the dangers of unchecked money printing.
Yeah, really powerful reminders.
It shows how quickly things can unravel.
So moving to something a bit more recent that many of us have experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments around the world, including the U.S., took pretty dramatic measures to support their economies.
Yeah.
What role did increasing the money supply play in those responses?
Well, in response to the pandemic's economic downturn, the U.S. Federal Reserve did significantly increase the money supply.
Okay.
And one interesting thing is that they actually changed the definition of something called the M1 money supply, which basically measures the most liquid forms of money like cash and checking accounts. In May 2020, they included savings accounts in that measure, and that led to a more than four-fold increase in M1 in a very short time.
Wow.
Quite a dramatic shift.
So what was the impact? Did we see inflation spike right away?
Well, as the economy began to recover, the U.S. did experience higher than usual inflation.
Okay.
The Consumer Price Index, which measures the average change in prices paid by consumers for a basket of goods and services, it rose quite a bit between May 2020 and June 2022. This period really highlights the potential link between a rapid increase in the money supply and a subsequent rise in inflationary pressures, even though other factors were at play as well.
It certainly makes you think. But then we have this really interesting source that challenges this idea that printing money always leads to inflation. They look at data from Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and they argue that although central bank balance sheets have expanded massively since the 2008 financial crisis, this hasn't always translated into a proportional increase in the overall money supply or a big jump in inflation.
Right, suggesting that the new money created by central banks didn't flood the real economy and drive up prices in the way many would expect.
Yeah, and they propose that factors beyond just the money supply, like demographic changes and how productive a country is, might actually play a more crucial role in influencing inflation.
Yeah, for instance, they highlight Japan, which has seen a huge expansion in its central bank's balance sheet for years, but has actually struggled with deflation, the opposite of inflation.
Interesting.
And the UK, too, they saw this historical correlation between central bank actions, money supply, and inflation sort of bore down after the mid-1990s. So it seems like the relationship might be more complex than just a simple equation.
Right. Maybe central banks' actions now are more about influencing financial markets than directly injecting cash into everyone's pockets.
Exactly. It challenges the traditional view.
It definitely makes you think about what other factors are shaping prices in an economy.
For sure. It raises important questions about how modern central bank policies actually work and whether our old economic models are capturing the full picture.
So, Naomi, apart from the obvious risks of inflation and the extreme scenario of hyperinflation, what other downsides to printing too much money do our sources mention?
Well, one major consequence is the devaluation of a country's currency on the international market.
Okay.
If a country prints a lot of money, its currency loses value compared to other currencies.
Meaning it takes more of your currency to buy the same amount of another currency.
Exactly. And that makes imported goods more expensive, which can worsen inflation, especially for things that a country relies heavily on from other places.
Right, because you need more of your own currency to buy the same amount of foreign goods.
Precisely.
So, for example, if your currency weakens, things like imported coffee or electronics would become more expensive.
Yeah. And it's not just about imports either. Excessive money printing can also mess with financial markets. It can push down interest rates to artificially low levels, which might sound good at first, but can actually encourage reckless borrowing and risky investments.
Hmm.
This can lead to what we call asset bubbles, like in the housing market or the stock market. And when those bubbles inevitably burst, it can cause significant economic damage.
Oh, yeah, like the housing bubble that led to the financial crisis of 2008.
Exactly.
And if multiple countries start printing money and devaluing their currencies, things can get really messy.
Oh, absolutely. It can lead to trade wars and all sorts of global economic instability.
And perhaps the most fundamental issue is that if people lose confidence in their currency, they might stop using it altogether,
Right. That's the ultimate breakdown.
leading to a complete economic collapse.
Exactly. It's like the glue that holds the economy together loses its stickiness.
So bringing it all together, Naomi, based on our deep dive today, why can't we just keep printing money to solve our economic woes? What's the key takeaway for our listeners out there?
Well, the main point is that while printing money might feel like an easy solution, a quick fix, especially during tough economic times, it carries some serious risks.
Yeah.
If the money supply increases faster than the actual production of goods and services, you're almost guaranteed to get inflation. This erodes the purchasing power of people's savings, hurts their ability to buy things, and in extreme cases, it can spiral into hyperinflation, causing massive economic and social upheaval. We've seen it happen throughout history.
Right. And while the relationship between money supply and inflation is complex, with factors like economic growth and how quickly money circulates playing a role, the basic principle remains crucial. Too much money chasing too few goods is going to push prices up. To maintain a stable currency, which is so vital for a healthy economy anywhere in the world, you need a careful balance between the amount of money in circulation and the overall health and productivity of the economy.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
So while the idea of just printing more money might seem tempting when facing economic challenges, our exploration today has shown that it's a dangerous path. The risks of inflation, currency devaluation, and broader economic instability are simply too great.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. You might get a temporary effect, but you're likely to make things much worse in the long run.
Yeah, a really powerful analogy. So as we wrap things up here, what really struck you from our discussion today? What questions does this raise for you about how economies function and how we can ensure long-term economic stability, both here at home and globally? It's a complex topic with huge implications for everyone. Thanks for joining us on Econverse.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Keep those questions coming.